All right, thank you very much, everyone, for joining tonight for the last Liberating Cinema event of the, okay, I misspoke. I'll start again. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining tonight for the last event of the Liberating Cinema Film Series. We're going to be looking at new Korean cinema, and it's a kind of nice way to finish. I'll let Connor explain why. But no, I mean, I would love to introduce our guest tonight. I'm really grateful and honored we have Dr. Connor McMorran here with us. And I'll let him introduce himself. He's an independent scholar here in Scotland and a real expert on South Korean cinema and Korean cinema in general. So I'm really glad that he can be here with us tonight. And then later on, after Connor speaks to us, we'll also have film curator Eric Choi join us, who's a film curator at the Korean Film Archive in Seoul. So this is our final week, and I'm really glad. For everyone who's been joining our series, I'm really grateful that we've been able to do this and kind of this discover new films, go through world cinema from silent era to present day. And this is kind of a nice way to finish, I think. So without further ado, Connor, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then maybe you can start us off and speak about new Korean cinema, Single Spark, however you wish to take it. Just a moment. Yeah, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, cool. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Mina. It's so weird to finally have this all come into fruition after talking about this so long with you over the years. It's kind of cool to finally have it happen, right? Yeah, so as Mina said, I'm an independent scholar. As a very occasional independent scholar, this is one of the few academic things that I've done since receiving my PhD in 2019. But yeah, my focus for my PhD was on South Korean cinema, and that is kind of what I have been pigeonholed into ever since that time. I do have interests in other things too, but I also really enjoy talking about Korean films, so hopefully this is of some use to everybody. Yeah, so it's interesting because Mina and I talked a lot about what to name this week. How should we kind of frame this this week through a title? And we couldn't really think of one, and we just kind of decided on New Korean cinema almost as a kind of default topic name for it. And I think that's interesting in a way because if you look at the history of Korean film, it's very much a history that isn't defined so much by artistic eras or movements or anything like that, but it's far more of an economic and business minded kind of history that Korean cinema kind of goes through. And on top of that, you also have you can also perceive it in a very kind of historical kind of who's ruling at the top of Korean society. It says a lot for how ways that we can perceive Korean film as well, right? So you have the Japanese colonial period until 1945, and then you get a brief period of respite, and then you've got the Korean War, and then obviously the splitting of the country into two successive years of military dictatorship in the south with Park Chung-hee and then Chun Doo-hwan. And then we arrive at democracy in the 90s, or late 80s, early 90s is the transition period. And it's this period, this moment here where South Korea emerges out of Chun Doo-hwan's very authoritarian regime into, a very Western liberal capitalist democracy, that these films and filmmakers are able to explore topics that maybe were, censored or considered taboo whilst under the military dictatorship. And so we have a few filmmakers that are collected under this term of New Korean cinema. I'm always very wary about these terms. I always find them quite tenuous, really, I mean, yes, they interacted a little bit, they had some interaction in these so-called cinema clubs or cinema events that students ran during the 80s. So Park Kwang-su, who is the director of A Single Spark, he was a significant member in the cinema clubs. Jang Sun-woo and Jung Ji-young, who are other famous, other two big names collected under this kind of umbrella term, worked together on films like Nambugun, which is a North Korean partisan in South Korea, which is another fantastic movie about history and memory and trauma that is well worth watching. And Jung Ji-young was very active in the kind of demonstrations against the encroaching freedom for US distribution in Korean cinemas. So they have this kind of political backdrop to them collectively, and they do interact every now and again, but really we should just see them as kind of like, you know, filmmakers that were granted this freedom and really took it and really went for it, you know, and really decided to explore like parts of history in Korean society and collective memory and collective trauma, and try to understand not just where, like how things had been, but also where we were going. So there's a lot of skepticism with the new capitalism that's emerging in South Korea during the late 80s, which is best typified by Jang Sun-woo's Songgong Shide, which is The Age of Success, and which is a film that is like this caustic, just absolutely like ridiculous satire where capitalism is essentially equated to fascism. You know, like literally people are seek-heiling the 10,000 won bill in that movie. Like it's absolutely like this, just this complete kind of attack on capitalism and the need to make everything into a product that is sellable. So these films are very much trying to, you know, examine and explore where Korean society is going. And A Single Spark arrives 1995. So we've had these movies existing at this point now for about 7 years by the time this film comes out. And it's very much at the tail end. If we consider this a movement, this is at the tail end of the movement, wherein Korean cinema is becoming massively more funded by conglomerates. It's starting to trend much more towards mainstream box office, you know, kind of a kind of mainstream desire for box office profits, right? And so you get films like, you know, films like Mr. Mama or First Love or you know, romantic comedies, or you get stuff that is like trying to be big budget kind of spectacle stuff. So films like Gumiho, The Five-Tailed Fox, and eventually the one that kind of changes everything, which is The Ginkgo Bed in 1996, which kind of like sets this whole motion of what would become the Korean blockbusters of the early 2000s, which was a horrible failure, and actually like led to pretty much the end of the career for Jang Sun-woo, who was one of the new Korean cinema directors. But so what you have in A Single Spark is a film that wants to not just be very politically minded and focused on Korea's history, and specifically its history in terms of labor rights. Okay, so it's a very, very political movie in terms of that, but it's also a film that wants to explore how we understand, deal with, and present these histories on screen. So it wants to question the very act of discussing history through film. And I think that that's a very fascinating idea. I think that it's a film that really wants to engage with film as a medium and what it can actually do with regards to exploring history in a way that isn't just about representing the events. It wants to also be about, okay, here's the events, but also we have to acknowledge that these events have been filtered through a filmic lens. There is a certain element of bias and glorification that may emerge through this kind of act of filming these events. And in a way, it's like one of the few films I've seen that really questions film as a mediator of history. How do we interact with history through film? And how can we understand that in a way that allows us to maybe improve the way that we represent history through film? Or are we like doomed to just endlessly glorify the actions of the past and understand history through this filmic representation rather than like the nuances of the actual events themselves? Yeah, that's kind of my introduction to it. I don't know if you want to have like a back and forth discussion, Mina, or yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think excellent. I think it's a very insightful. I mean, I in terms of like, and I'm really glad also you said that we've been talking about this a while, so I'm glad we have the opportunity finally to like talk about this and to share, about Korean cinema because I think although there have been so many books written now, at least it seems about Korean film, it's mostly like South Korean cinema after the 1990s and like historical context, everything else is totally left out. And like you said, the calling it a movement or new Korean cinema, I wasn't so much like, and you pointed out, you said it very well, but I also, when I called it new Korean cinema, it wasn't so much the intention to label it as a movement, but just to say kind of this, to focus on the aesthetic expression, this new innovation, what's really new there. That's the kind of interest. I mean, it also ties nicely to our first week, to the new Indian cinema. I'll talk about that later. But now when it comes to this, what you said here, I want to draw that, let's draw that out, or let's think about it. How do we interact with history through film? Let's start with that. I mean, how do we interact with history through film?
Well, see, I would argue that film, in recreating the events of history, almost overlaps history and kind of provides a filtered version of those events, which can never be fully like integrated into the, it can never be the experience as it actually was, right? And I should be clear here is that like documentary cinema I'm not really discussing here. Like I'm discussing, like historic films or biographic films or whatever, right? I think that by doing so, what we do is we overlap, or the filmmakers overlap a certain bias or a certain kind of subconscious bias onto the events themselves, and in doing so, just through the very act of like providing like stirring background music or rewriting certain events, like it's history but it's filtered history, and yet that might be the first time that people come across certain events, certain people, and so the relationship that we have with history becomes very kind of tenuous, and we have to like not treat it as, it kind of sounds kind of simple to say it, but like I think we're in danger of seeing historical reenactment as the actual, like as a direct link to the past, when it isn't. It's it's very much just like a current interpretation of the events at the time the film was made, and that's what the film itself discusses. The film is about a biographer who is trying to understand this person who did this very brave act of solidarity with workers, and the film plays around with this numerous times in terms of like we see events as they originally happened, like obviously not, it's not documentary footage, but then we also see the same event filtered through the lens of the biographer. And I think that in the same way, the film is also using its kind of like, it's the fundamentals of its like its visual medium, as a visual medium, like its very nature allows it to do this doubling of events in a visual manner that shows how we can glorify or kind of like heighten these elements which maybe were never there in the first place.
But can we arrive, this is a very, very good kind of now we're getting into it, can we arrive at a truthful like understanding of history? We can say that because another thing is, you mentioned documentary footage and I agree with you here, but to basically say, some people who also specialize in documentary or work on documentary, they also say even if you have documentary, they start problematizing it and saying obviously even how documentary is made, it's based on certain creative choices or certain dispositions or personal, depending on who shot it, how it was made and so on. Now, without doing that, how can we actually arrive at a kind of, because in this way we'll be in kind of eternal doomed loop where every film we ever make, no matter historical context, there'll just be another interpretation and we're just lost. But there's certainly like, as you said yourself, there are certain qualities of the film that, or of films that make them stand out and endure the test of time. Now, why is that? Is there like, do we arrive at more truthful, like understandings of history? I mean, obviously there's the one aspect of reenactment, but is it about that? I mean, are people really interested in just seeing something reenacted? Or is it more just about, is it the message? Is it something that they want to learn from that? Like how do you take that? I mean, with regard also Korean cinema, but yeah, I wonder, how do you see that? I mean, in the context here also of the labor movement, maybe we can connect it. If you tell us a little bit about the labor movement and what it means in the context of South Korea.
Okay. First of all, I'd say like in terms of documentary stuff, I think it's really interesting because we can bring in like Jean-Louis Baudry and all that kind of stuff, right? Like every, film is the cinematic apparatus is an ideological instrument, right? And the very act of choosing to point a camera at something is in itself ideological, right? Like by choosing to point the camera at something, you are omitting everything else that is not within the frame, right? And how, documentary can get wrapped up in these kind of discussions. So yeah, I think like I guess I'm not saying that we can't learn about history or that we can't come to know a certain idea of history through film. I guess I'm saying more is that like film maybe acts as a kind of like shorthand for history, right? It's all about the introduction to the event and it should be taken in conjunction with a wider kind of understanding of other materials which can point us towards a kind of and a kind of a greater understanding of history. And I don't mean to come across as skeptical, or I don't mean to come across as negative or anything like that. Like I just think it's interesting that this film chooses to discuss this through the medium of writing, right? Like because writing is fundamentally more abstract than film is in terms of how we perceive things, right? Like writing is an abstraction beyond visual signs or whatever, right? And so yeah, I think the film is using writing as a parable to discuss film and film's ability to represent history. How does it represent history? And I mean, it's notable that the film does end on a kind of hopeful note that by keeping the memory of certain events alive, even through reenactments or even through like the innate glorification through the camera lens, like it does mean that that legacy continues. It's just that I think that we have to be mindful that that legacy continues through a filtered reenacted lens, right? And that actually what we are seeing when we watch A Single Spark is not John Tail. It's not him, right? It's an actor. And I know that, again, this sounds very simple to say, but like we should allow that recreation or that reenactment of events to point us towards the actual event and the actual memory of the person themselves, right? And I think the film does this by having the same actor play John Tae-il and the student who is carrying the book about John Tae-il at the end of the movie, right? Like there is that bridging of kind of like, look, this is performance, but go back to history, go back and look at this actual event. As for the labor movement, well, I think that, you know, there was a lot of there's a lot of protests that were stifled, and they were constantly kind of like attacked, both under Park Chung-hee and under Chun Doo-hwan. And there was a constant struggle to kind of organize and to have a kind of solidarity amongst workers that didn't just involve any kind of retaliation by the successive military dictatorships. And so I think in many ways, A Single Spark is a film which like embraces its freedom to openly discuss the kind of the struggle for the labor movement during this period. And I mean, in many ways, it's following the footsteps of an independent movie that came out in the 90s or 1990, I think, called The Night Before the Strike, which was produced by an independent collective of filmmakers, and absolutely is like, we're talking like 2-3 years post democracy here, post transition to democracy, and it's absolutely just like a complete celebration of the will to strike and the will to be collective and have solidarity with each other. It features an amazing, absolutely, I mean, I think hopefully it will be like restored properly one day, and I'd love to see it like actually like released properly. But it features this amazing ending where this worker like gets all his other workers to strike, and they rush out against to fight against the police that are putting down a strike across the road. And then it just cuts to this like montage of montage of protests and like just like all these scenes of workers fighting against the police and all that kind of stuff, and then it like ends on this image of this worker with his wrench raised, and it's very Soviet and it's very powerful, and it's you know, it's just the kind of like, I feel like there was just this clear desire to embrace and celebrate these actions of the past in a way that like they hadn't been able to really under Chun Doo-hwan especially. And so yeah, there's like an embracement of the labor movement. But unfortunately that all dies down pretty much, you know, when you get to the end of the 90s and stuff, and following the financial crisis in the mid to late 90s and all that kind of stuff, and Korea's kind of further transition into, you know, something that is more akin to how it is today. Yeah, that kind of open political leftist celebration isn't really as common in films. I mean, like some filmmakers like Chung Ji-young is still making films. So he's the guy that did like Nambugun and all that kind of stuff in the early 90s. But yeah, like, yeah, so Single Spark is very much like the tail end of this. You have that, and you have A Pedal by Jang Sun-woo the same the year later. And those are kind of like the two final films of the 90s of this kind of like highly politicized examination of past trauma and memory.
Thank you very much. I loved how you said also pointing to history, because I think this is something we underestimate. I don't know, because sometimes in context we're very familiar with. We take films often at face value. Like I can compare it with film like Pretty Village, Pretty Frame, for example, which you've seen also we did a few years ago. And that kind of film, even for people who are like now in the use of successor states, whichever they are, often that becomes the definitive film about like dealing with the Civil War. You know, and like I think sometimes I often said it's the best kind of introduction to anyone who wants to understand what happened from the outside. Because as we spoke about, you know, it's made for the local, it's made for the people who lived through it, and not like for those who were outside, or an image projected, as were films perhaps by Kusturica or other filmmakers in the 90s. So I think that's important, by pointing to reality, but also knowing the wider context. Because I think sometimes, especially with historical films or films that deal with history or sensitive subjects such as war, there's a very dangerous like road of like, you know, generalization, or the kind of compartmentalization of films into like readings or political readings which fit with, you know, current trends or with current political views of certain countries, and that's kind of a danger, and it's obviously good to break that up. Now, but I wonder, maybe you can clarify, like to take us back a few steps, because I think this is an area we should also focus on another time. But regarding like the development of Korean cinema, because you obviously know so much about it, what is there kind of, could you give us a little bit about the history, just about of Korean cinema? And later, I mean, I think Eric Choi, who's joined us tonight, he'll speak about obviously more from the perspective of the archive and of film curation and curating Korean film. But in terms of like, if you can give us a little bit of an insight into Korean film history, and then also what happens kind of after the split, obviously the country's into two after the war. And also just one thing in the context of that, I mean, mostly focus on the cinema, but just one thing, I thought Korea or South Korea was capitalist even before, because that was my impression. Maybe I'm wrong, but perhaps you could also clarify kind of what transition exactly you mean, because when you say to democracy, but mostly focusing on the cinema.
Yeah, so capitalist, I mean capitalist in terms of like capitalism as we perceive it in the West, right? And in terms of like it being fundamental to the democratic process, and like capital being tied to the fact that we are free liberal people, right? Like I mean it in that kind of sense, whereas before under like Park Chung-hee's kind of like Yushin regime, and like his attempts to kind of like really like boost the Korean economy, it seemed like it was a very kind of like top-down form of like, we are taking on the kind of ideals and the economic concepts of the US, who we are partners with at this time, you know what I mean? And like, and then it was absolutely capitalist then too, for sure. But I mean it more in like kind of the idea that we perceive this transition into democracy as being democracy aligned with this kind of capitalist drive, that like now everyone can achieve everything that they want to, and you know, now it's truly like all about achieving this kind of the capitalist dream, right? Like before that, it was a very restrictive economic industrial kind of emphasis on capitalism, and following that transition to democracy, it becomes far more the wider kind of mainstream ultra marketability of capitalism, you know. So yeah, what period of Korean history do you want me to talk about?
Yes. So no, just I mean, you can give us a run through. It's up to you. But I wonder just how the development of cinema, basically, like what kind of
Okay.
we just spoke about new Korean cinema, and some people are familiar with kind of Korean films of the
Yeah.
90s and later, but just the earlier period, like how was cinema different before the division into the two countries, and then also like after that, how did cinema develop? I mean, what are some of
Sure.
the interesting films for you? I leave it for you to kind of
Yeah.
take as you wish.
Yeah. So I think that the one of the frustrating things about Korean cinema is that so many of the films are lost, right? Like there is a great history of films that are only kind of like mentioned about or are fragmented, and we don't really have access to a great deal of them. So the majority of films that, not the majority, but like a good deal of films that do exist, like are available on the Korean Film Archive YouTube channel, which is a fantastic resource, right? And I think that many of the films that I will mention will probably be on there or have been on there at some point. It kind of shifts and changes over time. So yeah, like under the Japanese occupation, which is like basically the 1890s was when they started to really like start introducing bills, but it's generally considered to be 1905 to 1945. The Japanese occupation, you get like cinema emerging. So the earliest Korean films being like 1918, 1919. You see it emerging under a colonial reign, right? So it becomes very intrinsic to a lot of Korean cinema to try and harbor some kind of national spirit against this colonial reign, whilst also trying not to be censored, right? It's like trying to get that message out of a Korean national identity and retain that notion of Korean national identity as the Japanese increased their attempts to assimilate Korea into the wider Japanese empire. So it's really interesting because you get films in the 30s that are really, it's just like in the surviving prints, it's just the Japanese subtitles at the side of the screen. And then by the time you get to the 40s, most of the films are like Japanese names and there's Japanese language and all that kind of stuff. Like the transition, you can see it occur through how cinema is being used. And so like a film that I absolutely love from that period is called Spring of the Korean Peninsula, Bandoi Bom. And it just for me it exemplifies like it's about a group of filmmakers that are trying to create an adaptation of Chunhyang, which is a very famous kind of folktale. And the ending of that film, like they have to receive Japanese funding, and the way that the film presents it is like it's just this like utter defeat. You just see it in their faces that they have to receive this Japanese funding in order to make this film. And so even though the narrative is playing it up as like Japan has saved the day, look at these Japanese funders allowing this film to be made, like the film's camera movements, the way it isolates and fixes on the faces of people who clearly aren't happy, like I think it's incredible. Likewise, like a film like Angels on the Streets, Jibom Chonsa, is absolutely fascinating again because it's all about a brother and sister that are broken up, and the boy goes to live under a Japanese supporting orphanage, and at the end of the movie the brother and sister are broken up again after briefly reuniting, and underneath this Japanese flag, you know all everyone's waving goodbye to the sister as she departs, and this boy is crying. Like the family unit has been broken up, and like this boy is clearly crying. He doesn't want to be taken away from his sister, and like one of the workers at the orphanage grabs his hand and makes him wave. And I'm just like, it's just such a perfect encapsulation of the way that like the Korean people are being subjugated and just absolutely like just torn apart by this Japanese rule. And I think it's just fascinating examples of how to subvert overtly kind of like a colonial oppressive state. After that, after Japan is defeated in World War II and we get the Korea is liberated, You get a bunch of movies which celebrate that, you know, like Chayumansi, Hurrah for Freedom. And they're very much exactly what you think they are. They're stories about being victorious over the Japanese, or struggling and fighting against the Japanese. And then we unfortunately get to the Korean War, 1950, and the subsequent splitting of the country. And following that is when Korean cinema as like a industry properly begins. So that's when you start to get genre cycles, and that's when you start to get just many things that we tend to think of when we think of a film industry. And obviously when we get to Park Chung-hee, we get a massive kind of push into like co-productions. A lot of this coming from Shin Sang-ok's Shin Film Production Company. So you get like Korean cinema starting to work with like Hong Kong and all this kind of stuff, and these filmmakers, kind of filmmakers and actors kind of moving between neighboring countries, and you know, just a general kind of like a lot of importation of like Hong Kong martial arts films in the 70s and all this kind of stuff. And these genre cycles kind of go wild. So there's a whole bunch of martial arts films in the 70s. And then in the 80s, film gets used more ideologically by Chun Doo-hwan. So film is used in many ways to kind of like to distract people from the many horrible things that occurred, like the Gwangju massacre. And so we get what this is. I mean, it's kind of disputed if this is actually like a real thing or not, but what's called the 3S policy, which is sex, screen, and sports. And so what you get is like a lot of erotic cinema coming out during the 80s, with the idea being that like we're going to have film cinemas opened late night so people can come to these and they can enjoy these erotic films, with the idea of like liberation of a liberated screen, but actually it's just a means to kind of like distract people away from what's actually going on. Yeah, and then by that point, Chun Doo-hwan gets ejected in 1987, and Roh Tae-woo gets elected, and then we transition into democracy, and then the new Korean cinema emerges. And that's kind of a rough idea of the history of Korean film, I guess.
Thank you very much. Sorry for putting you like in a brief way on the spot for kind of breaking down the film for us. I know it's a lot more nuanced and complex than that. And in our many conversations, I hope we'll have a more chance to like kind of focus on other periods of Korean cinema. But I like what you said about the resource. So yeah, the Korean Film Archive channel on YouTube is very useful, and it's been very helpful in terms of exposing people to Korean cinema, and also the restorations that have been done by the archive. So I think this is a great point to kind of complement what you've been saying, Connor, and everything you've said to us and shared with us about the film history, and get someone who's well, from Korea, from South Korea, from Seoul. Eric Choi is a film curator, and he's at the Korean Film Archive in Seoul. I'll let him introduce himself, but perhaps here we'll hear more a little bit about the work of the archiving, the restoration, and kind of the curation of Korean cinema that goes on both nationally, but also its significance kind of internationally. So please, Eric, feel free to unmute yourself just a moment. Yep. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Oh yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to finally meet you, Mina, after I think over a year of corresponding over email.
Yes.
And
Likewise.
thank you. Yeah, and it's also nice to meet you, Connor. I apologize for missing out on maybe the first half of your talk, but what I did hear was very informative and interesting. Couple notes actually I took from that. You mentioned, I love that you mentioned the Paopjeonja, the night before the strike, in relation to A Single Spark, because the connections in terms of like a semi-socialist themed film about the labor movement in Korea, the connections are very direct, and Paopjeonja was a very historically important film. Interesting is you talked about whether the film would be restored or not. We actually already restored it a couple years ago, and it was actually re-released in Korean theaters 2 years ago, like in commercial theaters. And I think it maybe was the first time that that film actually was released in commercial theaters. I don't think it ever happened, even like when it was released. It was just like independent screenings. So hopefully at some point, maybe that goes on our YouTube channel. Maybe we publish a Blu-ray at some point. Hopefully you'll get to see the restored version. But from what I remember of seeing of it, it's pretty beautiful. Thank you for doing the heavy lifting of summarizing Korean, not just Korean film history, but Korean history. I would not to be in that position. It's pretty extensive, but I think you did a wonderful job.
What are some of the films that you think have been really truly subversive? You mentioned the one from the 90s, the strike one, the night before the strike. But are there other examples? Because I'm thinking of other films also from like the 50s that deal with like the Korean War. And from what I noticed, there's so many films that are about the Korean War or about working that relationship with history out. So are there earlier examples of like films you would say are new? Or, you know, perhaps we could even bring that into contention. Is there new Korean cinema before new Korean cinema? You know, what do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting because when we think about freedom to be able to express certain ideas about Korea or Korean history or just ideas about society, there's certain periods where it kind of emerges, where it kind of pokes its head up and it's available. One being the period of transition between Park Chung-hee to Chun Doo-hwan, where you get this kind of this moment where it's potentially more relaxed, and so you get some absolutely fantastic movies that are very kind of they interrogate the concept of society and people's place within society and relationships between the classes and all that kind of stuff. So a perfect example of that would be A Fine Windy Day by Lee Jang-ho, which is from like 1980, I think. And I'm pretty sure that is on the Korean Film Archive YouTube channel and it's absolutely worth watching. It's a fantastic film. And prior to that, you get some films in the 70s. So a film that I would absolutely say is worth exploring for in terms of freedom and relative freedoms under Park Chung-hee would be March of Fools, which is just an absolutely incredible movie that I think everybody should watch. It explores like students as they struggle under this regime and how they adapt to it in their everyday life, and just the conclusions that film takes you to in terms of where the friends end up is absolutely fascinating and says a lot about a very kind of skeptical idea of where Korean society is heading in the 70s. Specifically for the Korean War, though, it's interesting because you get films that are about it at the time, well, just after in the 50s. But I think that in many ways, that was Korean cinema finding its footing post-war. And so it's trying to reconcile with this fact immediately after the fact. And so there's a lot of kind of discussion that verges quite a lot on melodrama and melodramatic ideas of how to respond to this period and to this great tragedy. There we go.
My presentation is called KOFA, an introduction with a focus on acquisitions. And the reason being is that I want to take this opportunity to just give you a general idea of what we do at the Korean Film Archive. But since I've spent about 5 years in the acquisition team as a film curator, I think the latter half of this presentation is more focused on the acquisition side of things. And I'm going to try to make, you know, these things tend to kind of maybe be dry for a lot of it, but hopefully it'll be informative and entertaining, and I'll try not to take too much of your time. So first of all, so this is our official mission statement. It's not the best translation, but contributing to the improvement of national cultural sentiment through the collection, preservation, and rediscovering value of Korean films and film-related materials. So to put it another way, and what we base much of our decision-making on is how best to pass on our moving image cultural heritage to future generations. So everything, all the decisions made from the acquisition to the cataloging, to the preservation, to the restoration, all are based on the idea that this is not just for us, this is for our future generations, and how best to leave it to them. So this is a brief overview of the history of our archive. We were established in 1974. We joined FIAF, which is a Federation of Film Archives. It's a Europe-based organization that brings film archives from all over the world together. We became a member in 1985. We're a nonprofit organization funded entirely by the government. So, so our entire budget is from taxpayers' money. And we're also nonprofit in the sense that most of our facilities, including our Cinematheque, our library, our museum, are all free of charge for visitors. So if you're ever in Seoul and you have, the chance to come to Sangam, which is sort of at the northwestern end of Seoul, it's a good place just from a cost point of view. So KOFA is currently, there are two main buildings. One is Sangam, which is the place I just mentioned, and one in Paju, which is a city just outside of Seoul. The Sangam facility includes our Cinematheque, our film museum, our reference library. It also includes 6 film vaults where we preserve mostly copies or prints. Our Film Preservation Center, which is in Paju, which we have been operating since 2016, includes 10 film vaults where we primarily store original materials, so original negatives, etc. Also, we have a film processing lab there, a film digitization restoration area, and also color grading and sound mixing area. Lots of facilities tailored towards restoration. And just a brief look at our holdings. This number changes all the time, but basically we have around 8,000 titles of fiction. Materials, we're talking about, like, let's say one title could have multiple prints, multiple negatives. So in terms of materials, we're looking at 18,500-ish. Nonfiction film is 3,900 titles. And then non-film materials, which is still video, audio documents, we have like around 817,000. I'll just skip this. This is sort of a history of our archive. I'll just mention that 1996 is a very important year for us because it's when the film mandatory deposit policy was initiated. I'll explain more about that later. Organization, this is in Korean, I apologize. Basically, currently our organization is split into 8 different teams, each handling a specific part of the archive. Okay, see, I'm going to switch now. See, this is these are the errors. So this is what our facilities look like. I don't know if people have been to our archive, but the left is the Sangam branch, where I work and where the main office is held, and then the right is the Preservation Center in Paju. Let's see here. And this is our Cinematheque. We have 2 theater boxes, and we screen about 2 to 3 films every day. We have all year round. We curate. We have 4 programmers, including myself, curating not just Korean films, but international art house and independent cinema. And it's a great place to watch movies. Let's see here. Oh no, I'm missing some slides. This was supposed to be some photos of the film reference library. I apologize for this. You can watch about 4,000 or so Korean films here. So much more than is available on our YouTube channel or our KMDB webpage, because we can bypass copyright laws since we're a public institution. Watching films within our public library is not subject to copyright, and so people are free to watch a huge majority of our collection here. And also there are lots of books, scripts of old film, copies of scripts of old films for reference. This is just a small part of our museum where the basic national cinema history is sort of laid out, and also includes some artifacts, such as on the right. I don't know if you could tell, but there are some film can reels on the bottom there, and those are there because those were the reels in which we found the oldest existing Korean film, which is Crossroads of Youth, 청춘의 십자로, from 1934. And we found that film in those particular reels. So they've the reels themselves have become cultural artifacts. So briefly about digital restoration. So KOFA has been actively engaged with digital restoration of Korean cinema since 2006, with our first project being Bound by Chastity, which is a Shin Sang-ho film from 1962. Starting in 2010 with the restoration of Mandala, the Ingontek film from 1981, we began performing restorations in-house, and now we maintain a balance of working in-house and outsourcing to restoration facilities. And also, we have also worked on digitization of our Korean cinema library since 2013. So to clarify, digitization is not full digital restoration, but does involve research into available film elements, digital scanning, assembly, color grading, basic level of image and sound restoration. So you can think of it as like a minor form of restoration, but the good part about that is it's a lot faster. We can do a lot more per year. And so we there are titles we restore and there are titles that we just digitize. So just on the screen there is The Housemaid, and I'm just going to briefly touch on 3 digital restoration projects that were particularly important for us. The first being The Housemaid. The restoration was supported by Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Project. I think then it was known as Film Foundation. The interesting part about this restoration is that 20 minutes of the film was sourced from a poor quality dupe negative, and so it had burnt-in English subtitles. You can maybe tell in this slide at the bottom on the left. You can see just giant English subtitles copper plated onto the film. And so there was some attempt to remove those subtitles from the screen. And this required 2 years of research and development to come up with a software solution. And the result was fine, but not perfect, since the presence of the subtitles, or the specter of the subtitles, if you will, could still be discernible on the screen. You could still tell. And in fact, I think with modern technology, you can actually achieve the same results just using AI software. And then the second second significant project was Aimless Bullet Obertan. This is a classic from 1961 of Korean neorealist film. The only available film materials were sourced from a print that was screened at the 1963 San Francisco International Film Festival. So it had prominent burn-in English subtitles throughout the entire film. So the challenge was to remove all the subtitles from the film in addition to the screen restoration required. This was about 40 minutes of footage, just tallying up all the length of any part of the film that had subtitles on it, about 40 minutes, 56,827 frames. And this involved 3 visual effects houses who worked on it for 2 years. And you can actually see the results on our YouTube channel. It's on the KOFA YouTube channel. And the results are pretty outstanding. You really can't tell. And I encourage you to check it out whenever you have the time. You can also find before and after comparisons in motion, I think also on our YouTube channel. But the problem was the time commitment and the funding involved were extremely high. So this was not realistic to do something like this for every film moving forward. This was a very special case. And then we come to Seongchunhyang, which is more recent. We restored this 2017, 2018. This also had burnt-in subtitles, but this time it was on a color film. So that presented its own unique challenges. And you could also see the results of this on our YouTube channel. And this is the YouTube channel. For those who aren't aware, we have over 200 films on here, all with English subtitles, sometimes with additional subtitles such as Italian and Arabic maybe sometimes. And So I encourage anybody who's remotely interested in classic Korean cinema to come here, including for A Single Spark, which is the film that was discussed, is on here, which was a digitization effort. It wasn't a restoration, but actually the results still look pretty amazing. So definitely check it out. Okay, and now we go into the acquisition part of the presentation I have here. Currently, it's known as the acquisition and cataloging team. So basically, this is the team that would be the first responders, I guess, to Korean films incoming into the archive. And there are four main methods of acquisition. The first I'll talk about is the mandatory deposit policy. So some key points, legal mandatory, so the mandatory deposit policy is the legal mandatory deposit of Korean films produced today. So this was implemented in 1996 to prevent the disappearance of today's Korean films in the future. Connor, actually, I'm grateful that you mentioned that a lot of Korean cinema of the past have been lost over the years, and it's just not, you cannot view it right now, especially those dating from the 60s and prior. And the reason is because there was no standard for preservation at the time. Also, Korea was not an economically stable country until perhaps you can argue maybe the 1960s. So with that in mind, our goal is to, take care of the films that are happening right now, which I think is neglected in many parts of the world because of how accessible films are today with the advent of streaming. But accessibility doesn't mean guarantee of preservation. Things can just disappear, especially in the digital era. Things can just disappear on a whim. And one thing to mention is the current standard in determining deposit requirement is that films have to have been rated by the Korean Media Ratings Board. I won't read all this, but this is the law that the mandatory deposit policy is based on. It's the Promotion of the Motion Pictures and Video Products Act. So this gives you an idea of how many films are deposited to us. So when we started in 1996, it was 19 films, so not many. But so let me show you the graph in the next slide. When we get to maybe past like 2014 and up to 2018, the number of films that are deposited in our archive has skyrocketed to almost 1,000 per year. And the reason that is because there are many more films out now that are created for the VOD market. You can maybe derogatorily call them, softcore pornographic-ish kind of materials designed for just the VOD consumption. But those are rated by the ratings board. They're cinema. It's not for us to judge their quality. That's not what we do as archivists. Our job is to treat, as much as we can, treat all cinema equally. I know that's an impossible task for us because ultimately our choices as to what to restore even constitutes making a decision about the importance of a film. So it's unavoidable, but in terms of depositing, in terms of preserving films, we do the best we can. It's a challenge because over 1,000 per year, I mean, it's straining our servers because since all films are digital, they require actual space to store. And so that's a challenge for us, but it's a challenge we're still working on. And then let me talk briefly about the second method, Indie Film Archive. So the Indie Film Archive is a collection of Korean independent films that are excluded from the deposit policy. So the deposit policy is based on films that are rated by the Korean Ratings Board for release, whether it's theatrical or digital. But there are many films that don't fall into this category. So for instance, there are independent films that play at festivals but don't receive commercial release, in which case it played at a festival and then it's in the possession of the filmmaker, and that's about it. And so our job in this is to sort of decrease the gap. So we created an indie film archive initiative. So selection begins from researching local and international film festival lineups, but it can also be just word of mouth films that that maybe haven't played at a festival, but people know about. And all of these films are available for viewing at KOFA at the library. So this is the number of collected indie films. We started in 2004, and total of 2,108 films up to 2018. I apologize for this being outdated. Third method, Cinema by the Museum campaign. Cinema by the Museum campaign, which is 박물관 옆 박물관 옆 영화관. The title was sort of a play on 미술관 옆 동물원, the art museum by the zoo, I think is the title, the film. If for those of you who know, it's a classic film. So key points here is this is the collection of wardrobe and props from recent Korean films. So we consider, in addition to film materials and related film materials such as scripts and stills and whatnot, we also consider wardrobe and props to be important cultural artifacts. It's interesting when an object appears in a film, it sort of transforms into an object of aura. It gains an importance. It gains something that didn't have, and so this is an opportunity for us to collect these items and also to display them in our museum. We make them available for viewing online and also at the museum. And again, this is an opportunity for people to experience Korean cinema more intimately through materials. I'm so sad that this, let me see. I think I have it here. Yes, here it is. Okay, so this is what how these kind of items are usually displayed. The left is wardrobe from a Spy from the North, I think is the English title. The right is from Inlang, which is a Kim Ji-woon film from 2018. This is sort of how it's displayed on our website. You're able to access each individual film. Oh, and this is Extreme Job. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but a wardrobe from Extreme Job. And this is a special photo I took 2019. I even dated it, 2019, July 10th. This is when the wardrobe for Parasite arrived in our office. So it was a very exciting time for us. This is just some my colleagues at the Korean Film Archives are excitedly looking at. We were unable to get any other props. Like, for instance, we really wanted to find the stone. I mean, because of the obvious significance. But unfortunately, I believe those were sort of handed out to members of the cast and crew. so it's in their possession. Let me see here. And let me just skip to finally, discovery of lost Korean cinema and related materials. So this was where my work was based for about 5 years. So this is discovering Korean cinema and related materials that are thought to be lost. So Connor mentioned that a lot of Korean cinema have been lost over the years, less than 50% from the 1960s, and it gets much worse from prior to that. And so the work here is to discover and restitute as many as we can, both inside and outside of Korea. So so this is to obviously help the development of Korean film history research, because we're obviously limited by what we can actually watch, availability. And so I like to think of the finding of each film as sort of slowly completing an incomplete puzzle. Everything is a jigsaw piece. And the things involved is basically to establish good relationships with individuals and institutions globally, and to research the history of Korean film distribution, and basically have high hopes, have faith that things will turn out. because you can go years without like finding the certain thing you're looking for. So this is sort of a breakdown of how much of Korean cinema is still with us. So Korean cinema, you could say maybe began in the early 1910s, and as you can see, the percentage, no Korean films from the 1910s and 20s exist today. And then we have some films from the 30s, a little more from the 40s, not much from the 50s because this is, remember, the Korean War. And then it gets better from there, but you can kind of see the correlation of the founding of KOFA in 1974 and like the percentage of films that are actually preserved here today. So there is like an important work that we do as an archive and any archive around the world in preserving film. And with the 1996 mandatory deposit policy implemented, we're almost at 100%. So that's great. But over 1,549 Korean films, or 16% total, are lost and require rediscovery. Let me see if I can find the, yeah. So this is just an example of like on location kind of site when we visit, usually warehouses, sometimes personal homes where they have stacks of boxes filled with film, unidentified film. This is from 2018 with the film distributor Hajunsa. We received a donation of their materials. Theirs is more of the recent cinema, more of the new Korean cinema era of film. And then this is another example. This is a private collector who is actually the son of actor Kim Hee-gap, who is a very famous Korean actor in 1960s, 70s cinema, sort of always plays the comedic sidekick in roles. And his son obviously had a lot of memorabilia related to his father. And so he decided to donate his collection to us. And this is very delightful to me personally. This was donated by Jeonwonsa, which is a film distributor and production company, actually. And they're responsible for most of Hong Sang-soo's films. And so all of these items on the screen are from Hong Sang-soo's work. So just speaking briefly about some findings we had. This is one of the local findings, aforementioned, the oldest surviving Korean film, Crossroads of Youth, from 1934. I had some pictures here, but they're not working. And then some films from the Hanusap Hangyo collection. I'll just skip over these. Oh boy. Okay, so uncovering, so overseas findings, which is my focus of expertise, actually. So looking outside of Korea in search of some lost Korean film materials. And the uncovering of lost Korean films from overseas began in 1986. And in 33 years, we found 126 narrative features and restituted them into our archive. Let me see. I just want to show you a photo. Yeah. So these are sort of the countries that we've found some lost Korean films from. And so China, we found 10 films from China, mostly from the Japanese colonial era. Chances are actually that if you're watching a film, a Korean film made during the colonial period, they were found and restituted from China. Some films from Japan, Russia. Also, China and Russia actually are the two archives that held the most in terms of colonial era Korean materials. A lot of films from Taiwan, where films from the 60s especially were exported to, and a lot of films from Hong Kong. Connor talked about co-productions that were made with Hong Kong in the 60s, and those are some of the films that are on here, but also there are sometimes Korean filmmakers that have emigrated to Hong Kong to work, such as Jung Sang-hwa. So there's some of his films on here as well. Hong Kong was a gold mine for us in terms of finding lost Korean films. So this is an example of a co-production, actually, a Shaw Brothers co-production with Shin Films. This is a Goddess of Mercy, or Tepokun. The interesting thing about this film is that there were two versions of the film, one for Hong Kong audiences and one for Korean audiences. And the way they went about shooting this film was to have two actresses, one from Korea and one from Hong Kong. So the Korean actress is Cheoni, so she's very well known. And then Lily Hua is the Hong Kong actress, and they played the lead role in the film. But they would take turns shooting their scenes that they appear in. And then the end result would be, there'd be one version of the film starring Lily Hua on the right, and then one version of the film starring Cheoni on the left. And up until very recently, only the Lily Hua Hong Kong version could be seen. But since we were able to discover the Korean version of Tepokun in the Shaw Brothers archives, we were able to digitally scan and bring it into our own archives. So that's very exciting. And this is a photo of them together on set. It's very interesting, with their assistants, I think. So that's very fun. I'll just skip over this. So this is just a briefly, we also discovered, speaking of alternate versions, we also discovered an alternate version of The Marines Who Never Return, which is a classic by Lee Man-hee. We discovered the international version of the film, which is known as Marine Battleground. This was discovered in New Zealand at the Ngātaonga Sound Division. And the interesting thing here is not just that it's a dubbed, re-edited version of a well-known film. It's the fact that it contains scenes that were deleted from the Korean version, which is interesting. So it actually had, while being a very condensed version of the original film, it also has material not seen in the original Korean version that were directed by Lee Man-hee. So despite the fact that they were all dubbed over, you could still see new scenes from a film that we never knew existed. So it's very interesting. So this finding of lost Korean cinema is not just limited to finding films that are completely non-existent, although that's important. It also encompasses finding these sort of kind of alternate versions of films that have been sort of neglected, I think, over the years. And this is a Japanese colonial film materials. So fun fact, 90% of narrative films, so narrative feature films, and 95% of actuality footage, so documentary footage of Korea in the colonial era were all found outside of Korea. So they were never preserved locally, and we had to reach out to places like Russia, China, and sometimes Japan to find these films. These are some examples of some films we found. On the lower left hand, you can see one of the earliest footage of Korea in existence by Elias Burton Holmes, the travelogue. The second image is a film by Roy Chapman Andrews called Korea from 1912. This was one of the films that I found in 2017 at the American Natural History Museum. And then finally on the right is a feature documentary film from 1925 by a monk from Germany, Norbert Weber, who visited Korea in the early 1920s. I don't have the exact year, but he shot incredible footage of Korean people, and this is like hours worth of footage, and we were able to actually acquire for our archive. This is a photo of my colleague and I in front of the gates of the Russian Film Archive, where we visited in 2019. And this is us in front of the Steenbeck, just running through hundreds of film reels. It was quite an endeavor. And we ended up, I think, looking at maybe 480 something film reels in about 5 days. So it's just all day, just looking for any Korean materials we can find. And luckily we did. let me go back to my other slide. So we discovered a film. We made two big discoveries. One was an undateable film by a filmmaker named Lee Gyuzar, who was active in the colonial era. It was a short film, a short comedy film that he made that could potentially be one of the earliest motion pictures, just in terms of a fictional feature, or not a feature, but a fictional work. So, and then another one that's pictured here is a film called Ondor, which was a propaganda film in the 1940s that by the Korean colonial government to introduce some aspect of Korean culture to Japanese audiences. And Ondor is a form of a heating system that was developed in Korea. So this was sort of a short documentary about that to introduce the technology to Japanese audiences. And this was reported in the press quite a bit. And then we're already like really late, so I'll just breeze through the rest of this. So another thing is quality checking that we do. I do need to go back to the other slide. So when film materials come into the archive, we're mainly talking about deposited materials. Nowadays, everything is digital. We're in the digital era of cinema, so everything comes in these sort of hard drives. And so there's the job of several of my colleagues is to quality check the moving images, which really means for the most part, watching it from beginning to end and looking for any kind of error. It's pretty painstaking. And in terms of the sheer number of films that are coming in, it's we do have a problem of backlog. There's just so many films that need to be watched and cataloged, and sometimes multiple versions of the same film. I mentioned sort of titillating films aimed at the VOD market. Most of those films have at least 3 versions, labeled director's cut, unrated cut, mostly for marketing purposes. So really, it's not, the film itself isn't all that different, but again, our hands are tied. It's not our job to determine which of these films should be preserved for the generation, the next generation. So we're forced to watch all of it. And I do feel bad for my colleagues who have to quality check all this, because honestly speaking, a huge amount of the films they watch are sort of that category of films, or sort of semi-pornographic films. And so we're always talking about, like, does this do any kind of psychological damage watching all these films all day? But that's sort of a fun story. So just an example of a digital glitch. It's probably not very noticeable on the screen, but if you look closely, there's a small, tiny digital artifact glitch on the left-hand side. This is from Blade Runner 2049, but this is not a film that would normally come into our archive, but just as an example of a digital glitch. Let me see.
Eric, sorry, I just wanted to add, this is wonderful, but maybe we can look to just bringing it together so we can have a little bit of time for discussion.
Yeah, sure. I'm terribly sorry about this. I think I'll just end it up with, so there's quality checking, there's also cataloging, which I won't get into, but basically cataloging all the information about incoming materials into our internal database. And then there's the film collection loan, which is assisting individuals, institutions, and film festivals in accessing our collection, and also providing information about our copyright. And we as an archive believe that it's important that our collection actually be accessed and used. Otherwise, we're just preserving for no apparent reason. So, and yep, that's me. So thank you. This is my contact information. I'm currently on a sabbatical from the archive, so this is my personal email, but if you wanted to contact the archive directly, this is their email. So that's it for me. Thank you for all that.
Thank you very much, Eric. I don't think a few words will do justice to what you kind of shared with us. And it's a really great, I think it complements what Connor talked about really well. And you have a really give us an in-depth and serious, from your serious experience of work at KOFA. You really shared with us kind of what the really detailed and kind of intense research you do before you kind of do your preservation, but then how the whole process works, how your whole archive works. So this is very useful. And I loved what you said, because this also being our last week in the film series, it kind of ties things up nicely. So it's about getting access to that collection again. And what you said at the end there about what are we preserving it for if we can't access these films. So, and preserving them for future generations. So thank you very much for this. I wonder if Connor, for the end, if we can kind of bring a discussion now, and I'll invite people to ask questions as well. But I wonder if Connor, kind of from what you took from this, if you want to kind of say in response to Eric, something that you picked up, because it would be nice to get a discussion going between you two, but then also to get people involved. So if anybody else also has questions from the audience, please just raise your hand or message me, or in a few minutes you can just unmute yourself. But first, Connor, please. Okay.
Yeah, honestly, that was absolutely fascinating. I absolutely love that talk. Yeah, it's so fascinating because I've been importing DVDs from the Korean Film Archive for years and years now, and so it's fascinating to get a look behind the curtain, and see things. And I guess I was interested in, obviously, availability of films is key to what gets put out on DVD or what gets promoted on the channel. And also you were saying about how you can bypass certain laws by having it housed within your own place. But I remember there was a very specific period of the Korean Film Archive which was focused on like director box sets, and even the early days of the YouTube channel seemed to be more focused around like, oh, here's a section of Kim Gi-young movies or something like that. And I wondered, like, what was, if you have like any insight into like whether that thought process still remains, whether it should be director focused or if it's more about a broad range of cinema now.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. And you're right that I think a lot of our early DVD publications were box sets in that way. We had I think the first was a Shin Sang-ok box set, Kim Gi-young box set. Kim Gi-young box set is a rare item now, I think. So if you have it, keep it. England Tech box set also. I think maybe the reason that we don't do those kind of box sets anymore is because in a way that we've sort of done all of the classic auteurs of Korean cinema that are fairly well known. Not saying that there aren't any more, there are plenty, but in terms of just recognition, even within Korea, I think there's not enough knowledge about classic Korean cinema aside from, Ingwon Taek, Kim Gi-young, and Shin Sang-ok, etc. And so we have done certain filmmaker box sets that were less well known, and the reality was nobody bought them. So that sort of, that does drive our decision making to a certain extent. Not because we're in need of profit. That's not the point. It's more just we do have to respond to like what the audience is looking for, and so I think a lot of our now we've focused on Blu-rays. We've moved from DVDs to Blu-rays, and our Blu-rays, I think, sort of focus on just interesting selections of Korean cinema, preferably not from any particular era, but like from like the wide range. But yeah, like you talk about like whether Korean cinema should be auteur focused, and yeah, that's a very complicated question. I mean, in terms of the archive, I wish I am always for moving sort of away from that point of view, because it's very narrow, and and the problem with that is that the same kind of films always get circulated because of that. One interesting thing is our restoration capabilities have increased with the technology and the times, and so it used to be we would be able to do maybe HD restoration, but then now we're at 4K capacity, and maybe we can go to 8K at some point in the future, who knows. But what happens a lot of times is that the same film undergoes like re-restoration sometimes, because there's just a demand for that film. Like I'm trying to think of an example, but nothing comes to mind. But again, I think like just in terms of like the auteur point of view, I think it limits how people perceive classic Korean cinema, and so just kind of branching off of that, I think it would be helpful. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. Yeah, most of my most of my thesis was about trying to move away from like mainly Western understandings of how we encapsulate and categorize cinema and try to perceive it as like a totality, and all the complications that emerge as a result of that. Yeah, I remember while I was writing my thesis, being very drawn to and building my sense of Korean film history around that list of the 100 greatest Korean movies that was published. And I feel like the archive has done quite a decent job of getting pretty much all of those movies available now. And I wondered if that was that like a core goal to try and make those films in particular easily available?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, that list, which was I think it was in 2014 that we created that list, and it was a compilation of lists from curators, filmmakers, critics of Korean cinema, over 100, I think. And then we created this top 100 film list, as you said. And that has always been a great reference point in terms of determining what films we should restore, what films we should make available. And I think actually every year, a portion of the restoration and digitization is to try to get all those 100 films digitized. It doesn't always, we can't restore all of those films, because a lot of times our restoration decisions are based not just on what films deserve to be restored or deserve, really, I mean, all films deserve it, but in terms of what films are we going to restore, like not only just the film itself, but also like what film materials are available. And so if only a beat up 16mm print is available for a film, it's not something we could realistically restore unless we put a huge amount of time and effort into it, which sometimes we can't. So, but yeah, I think that list, I'm glad that list was very helpful, and I'm glad that us making things available, that's the goal, really. I think ultimately for us, it's just to aid researchers and people interested in Korean cinema to be able to watch the films, and I hope we can always make more things more accessible. Yeah.
Thank you. I think Connor and Eric, this is both incredible presentations. I want to open up just for questions. We have a question from filmmaker Tel Vukac. Please unmute yourself. If you can turn your camera on, feel free, to just ask.
Just a second. Thank you both. Likewise for really wonderful, let's say, presentation and talk. I have a question that you maybe have some opinion or information on for Mr. Choi. Last year in Ihlava Documentary Film Festival, if I'm not mistaken, in collaboration with Korean Film Archive, some very early Korean films, like beginning of the century, 20th century, were made accessible. It was very limited number of titles, but they were accessible in their Korean documentary history of like recap section. And since the growing interest of international audience, and considering the, of course, that's not your primary goal, but in terms of accessibility, apart from the YouTube channel, like doing collaboration with some maybe festivals of the sort, is it something, how is the archive approaching it? Is there any plans for further developing it, or is it most like on the invitation from the festival?
Oh, thank you, Tia, for your question. That's a very good question, and I think it's actually both. So initiation from the film festival is extremely important. we do try to have certain collaborative projects every year. I think the one that I remember, I'm currently in London, and so the one that I remember is at the BFI. We collaborated with the BFI in showcasing colonial era Korean films for international audiences. I think for the first time in a theatrical setting outside of Korea. So there are certain projects like that every year, and not just bringing Korean cinema to audiences around the world, but also bringing other cinemas to Korea. So it's sort of a give and take situation. But I would say that you know, I've worked on the film loan aspect of the acquisition team. So I've assisted film festivals and in accessing our collection. And honestly, yeah, the initiative of art film festivals, I think, is incredibly important. I think maybe people underestimate how important that is in terms of how Korean film, how accessible and how many people are able to actually watch Korean films, especially in like a festival setting, because most of that comes from interest from the festival to us, and then we would do our best to assist them. But I think in terms of just, there's a limitation in terms of how much we can actually initiate ourselves. So I guess the answer is both are important, both are very important. And I hope that more film festivals step forward and contact us and try to get something going, because that's definitely helpful. But what I would add though, just briefly, in my experience, one of the roadblocks to Korean cinema becoming even more available outside of Korea is actually copyright related, because a lot of copyright holders, it's a case-by-case basis, but there are some copyright holders that just ask unreasonable amounts of money for a film being shown outside of Korea, thinking, oh, like it's a screening, international screening, it's, you know, they obviously have money, which is not always the case. And so there are actually a lot of classic Korean films by the production company Hwacheonggongsa that are rarely screened outside of Korea and rarely made available on any kind of platform because of these kind of issues. And so I would just mention that that is one of the roadblocks, but it's one of those things where you can't really, unless you are able to somehow like establish a great relationship with the copyright holder, it's sort of a difficult hurdle. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had a question maybe to bring, actually, do we have any other questions from audience members? I wonder, we have some other colleagues joining us, just a second. One.
Hello, I'm Łukasz Zoic from Faculty of Philosophy in Belgrade. So as a historian, I'll have a question that is more on the side of archivism and archival work and not the filmmaking business. So a question for Jin. I'd like to ask, when do you think that the valorization process will come into place? When will the archive become so filled that it has to choose which films are to be preserved forever and which films are to be discarded? Because in archival work with papers, you really have to discard a large chunk of documents you get in the archives.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you, Kasin. It's sort of a dilemma that every film archive around the world faces, I think, and we are no exception to that. We were lucky to be able to build a preservation center with a lot more film vaults and a lot more capacity of storage in 2016. But again, that's sort of just buying time, really, because ultimately we're receiving deposited films every year, now numbering almost in the thousands. And again, you were talking about paper materials, the same situation. Although we do collect less, I mean, like in terms of recently produced Korean films, we don't collect that many paper materials anymore because everything's digital. So we do collect a lot of digital materials, but again, like it's the same thing. Ultimately, it's a matter of storage. Whether we're talking about physical storage, or we're talking about like digital storage. Ultimately, it's storage, and even if digital storage, there's this idea that like, oh, you just buy more hard drives or you buy more servers, but that all costs money to buy and operate. And film archives are on a very limited budget, especially in some countries where the film archive is very poorly funded. I know like the archive in Indonesia in particular went through some very tough times recently. So you're right that, I guess your question was like, when are we going to be at that point where we run out of storage and we have to make decisions? That I think our goal has been to never get to that point. Is to always come up with new ways to store materials, to delay that decision as long as possible, because that decision in itself is I think is very dangerous for an archivist to make. But in terms of like whether I think it's dangerous, but it's being made every day. It's an inevitable. It's a reality that I think this idea that we'll preserve everything forever is sort of an ideal concept, but we try to, at least for us, we've tried to hold on to that ideal as long as possible. But you're right that maybe one day we'll get to the point where we have to make some tough decisions, and I guess at that point we'll start maybe making decisions about, for instance, if a particular film has 8 prints of the film available and they're of the same movie and they're not re-edits of each other, they're the exact same copies, then perhaps we'd have to remove them. But again, like that's sort of in the far future, and hopefully we can find a solution that will never get to that. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vokashin, for joining us from Belgrade. Yes, so I think, Eric, do you have a question? I mean, I have a question for also, this is very illuminating what you said, and also this connection. I'm glad we fleshed it out so much, kind of the role which you've talked about, archiving and restoration, but also curation in the writing and preservation of film history. So and Korean cinema in our subject of tonight. Do you have a question? I wondered, Eric, because we haven't maybe touched on this. Do you have a question for Connor? I'm interested now. I have to put Connor a bit in the spot. So I wondered or I can ask another one.
No, I do have a question. I guess like I'm always interested in how our activities as an archive is perceived like outside of Korea from the perspective of researchers and students and whatnot. And I have heard that our YouTube channel was, I think the most positive response we've gotten from anything we've ever done in terms of like response from outside of Korea has been our YouTube channel, has been just the ability to watch so many Korean films like with English subtitles. I think that's been very positive. But I guess like Connor, I was wondering, like, is there maybe anything you feel that we can maybe do better in terms of supporting researchers and students who are outside of Korea and are unable to, come to our archive to access things?
I think that I think something that is very interesting, and one of the reasons that I've been so kind of adamantly buying the box sets and the Blu-rays and stuff over the years is for the additional materials in terms of writings and just the context and the kind of general analysis and all that kind of thing. And I think, is there a place that can be accessed even if you're not buying these products? Like, is there somewhere where these writings are also being stored so they can be accessed? Because the majority of Korean writings in English are built around many of the big name directors, and there's very little about the lesser known works and the lesser known filmmakers. And these, you know, I relied so heavily, example for the Past on Earth box sets about the colonial cinema, like I relied so heavily on the writings about the films in that when I was working on my thing, just because they were like the only writings in English that really were available to me about these films. And so I mean, I guess the one thing I would say is like, it would be great to have these essays somewhere that could be easily accessible for researchers and scholars, just to have them as like a English language writing about films to start discussions.
That's a wonderful suggestion, I think. And to my knowledge, I think most of those are actually available as PDF files on our Korean website.
Right.
But you're absolutely correct that you have to dig through the website to get to them. And I think like I would not be surprised if nobody knew like how to access it. And I'm not even sure if it's available on the English version of the website, which actually needs a lot of retooling. It's very outdated. So that's a very good suggestion, and I'll be sure to like pass it on to my colleagues, I think.
Yeah, they might be there. I may just have not found them, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, because I've been so reliant on them in physical form as well. So I haven't really been looking for them online, but I just mean for people that now that these box sets are harder to get, and, you know, having them as accessible would be great, you know?
Yeah, and I think, you know, that brings up sort of an interesting thing about archiving is that, you know, it's one thing to make things accessible, just like let's say like uploading it onto our website, but it's another thing to actually make it really like findable, I guess. Like actually being able to navigate the website and find what you're looking for. I think that's a challenge that we're actually facing right now, is that we do have a lot of kind of digitized paper materials on Korean cinema available on our website, but you just need to find them. And I honestly think like we're at a point where we need to redesign the website to be a lot more easier to navigate, because it's brutal. Like I've had trouble myself. So but thank you for that suggestion. It's very helpful.
If I can touch base with Connor on this, Eric, I think like also the I would find something that I noticed in my other research, you know, work in cinema beyond Korea. I had is that, you know, national historiographies or histories of film written by domestic historians, or in my context, you know, in the Serbian context, they're often available in Serbian or in other languages. You know, in German, I also do in German, but they're not available in English. And it's kind of like for international scholars, or, you know, people who understand English but not maybe don't speak the native language, it's useful having these kind of domestic or national perspectives, because often, as Connor put it, and I think as we've often encountered, there's often this kind of lens we start reading cinemas through, and it's often often it comes loaded with political interpretations, and political interpretations that, you know, benefit the writer or the context from which they come. So it's kind of often nicer to have someone from the actual context telling you, you know, and even if that, like, you know, you can have also strange political or dubious political interpretations from that context, but even having that would allow you another, I think would benefit you and give you another level of insight or way into understanding how the history is written and how it's perceived by the people, you know, who made it, or, you know, who made the films. So I think that's important. Also, if I can just add, I think something like, I love the fact that you've put these films and made them accessible. One thing, if I can say, is for somebody who hasn't, you know, especially starting out, and for those who haven't watched any Korean films apart from maybe the most famous ones, it would be nice to have some kind of way. And I'm also working on this. I mean, this is part of kind of the mission, I guess, of Liberating Cinema, to try to make certain periods of film history, certain directors, certain movements, certain full subjects accessible and open to people. And this is why this is great. But I think if we can do this, or if there's a way you can do this through the Korean Film Archive, to, you know, tell people how to like approach these films. Because sometimes when you see a list of 100 Korean films, I have no idea where to start. You know, it's like, and then I see different meanings. You know, you start to like have, you wonder like, okay, oh, Madame Freedom's really famous because of this, or you're trying to unpick, you know, why there's certain films, you know, as in every film history, there's certain films that are on there because they just have to be on there. And then there's other films that are just pure discoveries that somebody, you know, like has put on there. So it's a kind of nice way to perhaps just to contextualize these films somehow for people who are encountering it for the first time. That would be nice. But if I can just add to Connor, or if I can ask him, and this is not just to bring us back to popular subject matter, but just to kind of address the elephant in the room in a little bit. Connor, what's the, and maybe Eric as well, but I'll ask Connor for now, what's the kind of influence, is there any impact of the recent films of like the likes of Bong Joon-ho or shows like that are now, you know, American shows, but supposedly South Korean, like Squid Game, that are actually having an impact on how Korean cinema is perceived abroad or internationally? Or are they having little impact? Is this just a kind of like a game that's gonna die away soon?
Well, I mean, like, I think Korean cinema post 2000 has a very, very specific, it got framed in a very, very specific way by Western distributors, right? So most of the stuff that came out was, you know, vengeance movies and violence and all that kind of stuff, and the horror films of like Kim Ji-yoon and all that kind of stuff. And it was framed very much as part of that, you know, like that awful Asia extreme branding that films were marketed as in the West, where it was all about transgressive violence or bloody images or whatever. And I think in many ways, like, Korean cinema has that in terms of how it's seen in the West. And also you have the film festival directors that have provided the other side of Korean cinema to Western audiences. So like Hong Sang-soo would be the perfect example here. But I think that there's so much else to Korean cinema that it's just, it doesn't get filtered through in that way. And I think, you know, like Bong Joon-ho is an interesting like example, because he really skirts around different genres and he likes to play with genre, and he likes to explore things sometimes through violence, yes, absolutely, but he does it in a very kind of almost detached, scientific, kind of analytic way of exploring violence itself on screen. And I think, you know, Squid Game is certainly something. And the thing that actually saddens me about Squid Game is that the director of Squid Game, some of his movies are absolutely fantastic, and they're absolutely like brilliant movies. I can't remember the Korean title now, but the film Silenced, about the children in the school, the deaf children. Yeah.
Bogani,
yeah, absolutely brilliant example of kind of like, you know, contemporary drama, exploring, again, collective trauma. And, you know, I would hope that people would watch Squid Game and then go and check these films out. But the problem is that that film is not accessible in the West really at all.
Sorry, just to cut in, Netflix made 3 of his films available after the success, including Silence, Miss Granny, and the third one, I will check, but 3 of them are now included in Netflix.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's great.
Well,
that's exactly what I want. Yeah, that's exactly what I want. I would hope that people would go and watch these films now. You know, not expecting the same thing they got out of Squid Game, you know, but, you know, like seeing that same kind of critical lens on society, but focused more through a realistic scenario. Yeah, so I think that Korean cinema is somewhat changing the way that it's being perceived lately, very recently, but up until this point, it's very much been, you know, your Hong Sang-soo or your Kim Ki-duk or these kind of filmmakers that were in the festivals, and then, you know, Park Chan-wook and all the violent movies and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think it is changing, but it's a very slow process. I think Parasite probably did a lot for that, like the Oscar win and all that kind of thing. Like, absolutely, I would hope made an impact on people maybe wanting to check out more Korean movies. But we'll see. I think it's too soon to tell, to be honest with you.
Thank you, Connor. I was just going to add to that. Maybe I think what I was getting at also, from my impression kind of with Bong Joon-ho's films, I had watched like Snowpiercer when there was, at least like kind of in this, you know, in Scotland and Britain, Snowpiercer wasn't available at all. You know, like if you remember, it was briefly then available, it became available on Netflix, but it was really obscure. And then suddenly when Parasite won, everything was distributed. But before that, you know, it was cut up by Harvey Weinstein. It was a lot of other stuff happened. The film wasn't released. And it was really interesting for me because, I mean, for me, Snowpiercer is one of the most critical films about, you know, capitalist system, a totalitarian system and everything. And it's incredible. But it's really interesting to see that the film was kind of just hushed up, at least in the West. And I was so puzzled by this, you know, why is such a film like this that, you know, clearly has all the marketable potential, if we can use those words, although I don't like them, it was kind of hushed up like this. And I'm kind of concerned that, now when Bong Joon-ho's kind of been made, his entrance or like to the West in a way in the English speaking context, and now seems integrated into that system. Whereas actually what was so interesting about a film like Snowpiercer is that was precisely disrupted in any system in that system, or the capital system in which it kind of emerged. So that I hope that this doesn't kind of, when people watch this film, and also because directors sometimes become implicit in the very structures, which they critique. So, and this is sometimes a danger. But with regard to Squid Game, another thing, like in that kind of, let's say a little bit like more negative vein, but then also I would like to look at something positive too, is I think it's kind of this new trend, at least with Netflix, and other big kind of American conglomerates and stuff, is to kind of make shows that are, pass them off as Korean, but actually they're just American funded, and it's kind of like, I don't know how this process works. This is a new, for me, it's really a new phenomenon, because it all goes through Netflix. Yet sometimes, the lines are sometimes not clear. Sometimes films are just distributed by such a company, but they were made entirely within that country. In other cases, Netflix funds it, and this new thing of like funding different language features and passing them off as from those countries. It's, I think, highly problematic. It's something to watch out for as well. How are we going to talk about history of cinema, especially with this whole movement of like canon and everything else? Our Netflix films are they actually going to go into the history of film, or are they going to be something else? So that's a kind of I think interesting point. And also the fact that generally about how distribution and accessibility works now, it always feels like there's a catch. Like with me, Netflix feels sometimes a little bit like McDonald's, but then at the same time, because it's all like, fast track, everything goes through, everything goes off. Feels a little bit like fast food, but sometimes then they throw you in like all of the restored films of Yusuf Chahin, and then you're like, what are you doing? Like, so it's kind of it's very interesting to see how international distribution is going and how these multimedia VOD platforms are being used to kind of promote international films, but at the same time, what catch? I don't know. So I don't know. I don't want to finish with that. I actually wanted to finish to say, just because I think we should wrap up, and I'm grateful that this has been our longest Liberating Cinema Film Series, discussion. I did not expect any less. I think we should challenge next time and do like a 5-hour one, just push it to the boundaries. It can be its own film in its own right. Eric can preserve it if it's worth preserving. If it passes your check. But no, I think really, I'm really grateful that you joined. Connor, like your analysis and kind of your knowledge of Korean cinema is just insane. And I can tell you from my experience, Eric, he's one of the few guys you'll probably find in Scotland or the UK that has like all the Asian films and Korean films that nobody else has. So, and also knows everything about them. It's not just about having them. So, and can tell you about them. So I always learn something, and it's always exciting too. So, and Eric, obviously your work as well. I'm really grateful that you shared with us all the work you do at the archiving curation. I hope we'll be able to kind of collaborate in future and do some more work together. So I'm really grateful. But just to finish off for Liberating Cinema, because this is our last night, it's been a great film series. I wanted to make that connection with our first week. We did back in August. We did a week on the new Indian cinema, and this was initially, I was going to call it Indian parallel cinema, but then during the masterclass with Shyam Benegal, he pointed out that, parallel cinema was a category imported, as Connor well put it, by Western intellectuals or by, certain theorists, and it's much more appropriate to call it the new Indian cinema. And I think there's this connection of, if you watch a beautiful film like Mantan, and if you can watch the restoration, which we made available, it's seeing how, film can really be used in new and truly liberating ways, if I can say like that, because it's like a film like Mantan, a film that's funded entirely by 500,000 Gujarat farmers, that's something totally mind-blowing just in itself. But then the film is high quality as well, this whole new means of how film is in the hands of the people, the poor, dispossessed, and it's incredible. So, and then bringing it back, we went through Yugoslav cinema, Serbian cinema, and then also we went through Bulgarian cinema. We had a week on Karađorđe as well, the 110th anniversary symposium of the first Serbian feature film, where we had the Crown Prince Alexander of Karađorđević in Serbia, and that was a great kind of guest of honor, incredible pleasure to have him as a guest of honor. And also a masterclass with Jelena Popović we did, who directed Man of God, which is the new film, and it will be playing, I have to kind of say this because for those who want to come and are interested, it will be playing at the St. Andrews Film Festival next week. It's the closing night film, and it's a kind of nice way. We couldn't show it because the film is still looking for distribution, but please join us if you can at the St. Andrews Film Festival next week. It's based in St. Andrews. Connor here, who's great, he'll be our jury member for the short films, so I'm very glad, and I'm looking forward to it. But then circling back now to tonight, we looked at classical Bulgarian cinema with Professor Alexander Donev. And then this our final session and our most intense and incredible, really, in terms of what we covered. New Korean cinema. I really like that we touched on this. You know, what makes a film new, and that you looked at, Connor. You touched on. You know, there's this political subject matter, but it's going deeper than that. And one thing that strikes me about A Single Spark is that it looks at this subject of labor, and you know, there's a subjects of history involved, but its ultimate aim, I think, from what I took, is to put it in a much bigger light of the value of human life. You know, how we take from that. So, and I'm grateful, I didn't say that at the beginning, I'm grateful to the Korean Film Archive, and thank you, Eric, for letting us show the film. Everyone else, please check out the Korean Film Archive's YouTube channel. There's a ton of great films on there, and Connor will be the first person who will give you recommendations. And also finally, we'll publish Connor's new essay on The Single Spark in the next few weeks through the Liberating Cinema Film Journal. So thank you for everything, for keeping up with us. We'll have our final masterclass of the year next month. And then from there on, we'll have the program starting from the spring and onwards. So, but thank you very much again, Eric, Connor, and everyone who joined. Thank you.